These are strange times. Italy has been in lockdown for several weeks now. We are only allowed to leave the house in exceptional cases. Only in this way it will be possible to control the dramatic effects of this disease. I hope that this country and the whole world will recover from this shock very soon, and maybe you will see this video at a time when all this will be just a sad memory. But I do not want to talk about this today. Rather, I would like to use the time to make a video that I actually wanted to make for quite some time. But for various reasons I somehow have never been able to finish it. It's about using a GoPro in low light conditions. That also includes indoor shots in artificial light. So the topic fits quite well to this quarantine situation. So today is about how to set up your GoPro for low light situations, and at the end I will give you some additional tips for indoor shots. Before we look at the settings, I would like to anticipate a few things. Basically, you should know that the GoPro's image sensor is very small. It is much smaller than, for example, the sensor of a DSLR. Its size should be about the size of the image sensor of a good smartphone camera. However, the size of the sensor is very important, especially in low light conditions. The bigger the sensor, the more light it can capture. For this reason, a GoPro will never be the perfect solution in low light or for shooting indoors. Nevertheless, it may be the best camera you have at your disposal. That's why you simply want to get the best out of it even in these difficult situations. Then it seems important to me to explain very briefly which factors, apart from the available light, have an influence on the brightness of the shot. Basically, three factors influence the exposure of a shot: the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. The aperture is the size of the opening inside your lens through which light passes. On a GoPro, the aperture cannot be changed, so this value is not so important for us today. The shutter speed determines the duration of the exposure time, that is how long the light can fall on the sensor. We can control this value on the GoPro. In low light conditions, the shutter speed should be as slow as possible, to capture as much light as possible. The last factor is the ISO value. This value determines how sensitively the sensor reacts to light. The higher the ISO value, the brighter the image because the sensor reacts more sensitively to the incident light. Unfortunately, if the ISO value is too high, image noise and artifacts are generated. The image becomes brighter, but the image quality decreases. It was important to clarify these basics before we take a look at individual settings, so that you can understand certain things better. Now let's take a look at the settings on the GoPro. I'm using a GoPro Hero8 today, but basically the same principles and settings apply to all other versions. But what's new on the GoPro Hero8 are the presets. They allow you to save different settings. So I'm going to create a new preset for my low light settings today, so I can quickly access them later. I'm calling them indoor, although of course I will use these settings for any kind of low light recordings. As far as resolution is concerned, I use 4K simply because it leads to the best results. But the resolution is not so important in this context. Much more important is the frame rate. The frame rate determines how many frames per second are taken. Basically, you should remember, the more frames per second are taken, the less time is available to expose each frame. In low light conditions, you want to capture as much light as possible for each frame. For this reason, a low frame rate is recommended. I use 25 frames per second because I live in the PAL region. In the US, you should choose 24 frames per second. As lens or field of view, I usually use wide, but especially for indoor shots, you should consider linear. Indoors, you will find a lot of straight lines, so the distortion of the fisheye lens will be very noticeable. I set the stabilization to high because boost leads to a relatively strong crop. Especially for indoor shots, I don't need a very strong stabilization. A wide field of view, on the other hand, can be an advantage depending on the shot. Now let's take a look at the Pro-Tune settings, which are very important in low light situations. I leave the bitrate at low. I have made several comparisons even in low light conditions and personally could not see any improvements when using a high bitrate. However, the file size increases considerably. The shutter speed is very important. As explained before, it determines the duration of the exposure and should therefore be as low as possible. However, the shutter speed not only affects the brightness of the image, but also the motion blur. A longer exposure leads to more motion blur. Fast movements get more blurry. Basically, there is a rule in filmmaking for the perfect amount of motion blur. The shutter speed should be exactly twice as high as the frame rate. The frame rate of 25 frames per second, the shutter speed should be a 50th of a second. At 24 frames per second, it should be a 48th of a second. So in low light, I manually set my shutter speed to 1/50. To get even more light, you could also set your shutter speed to the value of your frame rate. That means to 1/25 or 1/24, but you will get way too much motion blur. The image will look very blurry. You should also note that there is a drawback to manually setting the shutter speed to 1/50th or 1/48th. Because of the resulting motion blur, which in theory would be ideal, the electronic stabilization of your GoPro cannot work as efficiently. The electronic stabilization needs very sharp images to work properly. For this reason, the shot will not look as smooth as it should, even with the hyper-smooth stabilization. Optimally, you should use the camera on a tripod or gimbal. As always, I have put some links in the video description for you if you're interested in which tripods and accessories I use. Now let's have a look at the remaining settings. Exposure value compensation is not available as we have manually set the shutter speed. I leave the white balance on the GoPro mostly on auto. The automatic of the GoPro works normally very well, but the manual white balance would have some advantages. With very long recordings, the automatic could change the white balance without a clear reason, which could ruin your shot. A constant white balance also has advantages for the color grading of your footage. The correct value for the white balance in low light depends on the color temperature of your light source. The ISO value is especially important for low light recordings. As already mentioned, a high ISO value leads to a brighter image but also to more image noise. The goal should therefore be to set the ISO value as low as possible. As we have set the shutter speed manually, we can now change the brightness of the image with the ISO value. For this purpose, I set ISO minimum to 100 and then change the brightness of the image by setting the ISO maximum. In general, you should keep in mind, up to an ISO value of 400 the image quality is good. A value of 800 already leads to strong image noise. From 1600 on, the image is hardly usable. So I set exposure on low light with the ISO maximum. In order to do this faster, I create a shortcut for ISO maximum. So I always have quick access to the ISO value in my low light preset. I always set the sharpness to low. A high sharpness does not lead to more details. Instead, the edges are sharpened artificially by the camera. This may look good at first sight, but it is not cinematic and doesn't look professional. You can add some sharpening in post if the image looks too soft for you. Or you can set the sharpness to medium if you don't want to edit your shot. I then set the color to flat, because the flat color profile gives me more room for color grading. Use GoPro if you don't want to edit your shot. This way, we have set up our GoPro optimally for low light situations. I would then like to give you two more simple general tips for indoor shots. Use the available light as good as possible. That means if it's still bright outside, place your subject near the window and use the natural light as the light source. Then you should also pay attention to the dynamic range when shooting indoors. If it's relatively dark indoors but there is still daylight outside, your windows could burn out completely when they're in the frame. Such a shot won't look good. Avoid such a situation if possible or adjust your exposure accordingly whenever it makes sense. So let's recap the most important things. The GoPro has a small sensor and is therefore not particularly well suited for low light situations. Use a low frame rate, for example 24 or 25 frames per second. This gives you more light for each frame. Set the shutter speed manually to twice the frame rate, for example to 1/48th of a second when you are shooting with 24 frames per second. Adjust the exposure by using ISO maximum, but be aware that the image quality will decrease significantly from 800. And don't forget that the stabilization won't work as well in low light. And that's it for today. If the video was helpful for you, give me a like as feedback, and see you next time.